Our theme this year, really, that we assigned to ourselves was what advice would we be giving to presidential candidates? We have a presidential election coming up next year. It seems it started already. In fact, it seems the campaign started about 4 years ago. But what advice would give? I'm not going to try to summarize that, but simply offer some personal comments that certainly I would tell anyone seeking to become the President of the United States. The question I am most frequently asked, both by the public and by senators and congressmen when I testify before Congress, is where are we in our global efforts against terrorism? What's the score? I'm regularly asked that on the media, and I never know exactly how to answer what the score is. One time I told a reporter on television when he asked me that, I said, he says, what's the score in the global war on terrorism? I said, it's 3-2. He was satisfied with that for about 10 seconds and then asked, who's winning? And I said, well, that's a much more complex issue. We have made undeniable progress in reducing the operational capabilities of the jihadist enterprise. We have arrested some of their key operational planners. We have dispersed some of their training camps as a consequence of unprecedented unanimity of focus among the intelligence services and law enforcement agencies of the world. We have made the environment for them a lot more difficult. As a consequence, we have foiled a number of terrorist plots around the world. At the same time, we have not dented their determination one bit. We haven't blunted their message, the appeal to angry young men, whether in Cairo or the 11th arrondissement in Paris or the outskirts of London in some cases, their ability to convert that anger into participation in terrorist operations. The fact that we continue to foil operations is evidence of their determination to continue. Nor have we really, while pounding on the operational capabilities, we really have not yet effectively impeded the radicalization and recruitment process that continues to fuel that operational side that we are dealing with. I suppose if we were giving this briefing somewhere in Waziristan instead of Central Florida, we would assess the situation different. If I were briefing Osama bin Laden's PowerPoints instead of ours, I would say that, first of all, you must understand they have a different view of war than we do. We regard war as a finite undertaking with a beginning and an end. We want to know where we are, what's the score, what inning we're in, what's the progress. They regard war as a perpetual condition. Or as Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, one of their chief operational planners, put it, war is life. They believe that they are fighting, in their view, in defense of their community, that Providence commands that they conduct a jihad. They regard the mission of their central leadership as being that of inciting people to action. So while we think of degrading their operational capabilities, they think about building an army of believers. And unless we can begin to affect that, this is going to continue to go on for a very long time. With that view, they would assess their situation as having, to a certain degree, success. Certainly, they have, by their attacks, established their brand name. They have been successful in conveying this message. In fact, their communications have been increasing dramatically and are acquiring production values which are increasingly impressive. Their top leadership is intact. We are involved in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and indeed they would regard our involvement in Iraq as a gift from God to them, because it puts us, in their view, in the same position that the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan, and that this is a place where they can inflict a mighty blow on us, and if you adopt their mythology, it was the defeat and withdrawal of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself the following year, and therefore, according to the mythology, the defeat and destruction of the United States in Iraq will lead to our collapse. We're just another superpower. It does suggest that this is going to go on for a very long time, and indeed my advice to the new president would be, you have to anticipate that this will not only last throughout your first administration, your second one if you get one, and indeed will go beyond that. In any long-term contest, it is a requirement to conserve resources, blood, treasure, international support, and domestic support. And it is in that area, that last area, where I think that we have to do better. The message has been thus far a message of fear, unfortunately, to the American public, a message that has consigned the role of the American communities and the American citizens to one of being frightened passengers, with breathless announcements of this plot being foiled or that alert, we're all going to die by Tuesday, but keep shopping. That only has increased the anxiety. I think the message has to change to one that educates, engages, and enlists the citizens at the local community level. One other resource that I think we have squandered to a certain degree and really have to be careful to recover and preserve for the long run, and that is our own values. Our values, what we firmly believe in, what will sustain us in a long-term contest, is not defined by concrete barriers, by bollards, by new rules about surveillance. It will ultimately be based upon our own courage, our own commitment to our own sense of liberty and justice. These will be the values that will sustain us in the long fight, and I think that hasn't been an adequate message. And so going forward, and I'm very positive, by the way, this sounds all grim, it's not. We will prevail. In the long run, we have faced dark moments in our history. We will come through this ultimately, successfully, but the real challenge is to come through it with our democratic values, our fundamental values intact. Thank you very much.
First of all, my name is Magnus Fransson. I'm from the Swedish National Defense College in Sweden, Stockholm. Let me echo everything that Brian Jenkins have said. Let me also thank the UCF for the initiative of inviting outside participants. I'm going to be humble in not offering any advice from the outside of how the U.S. should, or any incoming administration, may act or do things, or perhaps do things differently. Let me just say that from a European perspective, and particularly to demonstrate what are some of our concerns, is not just the civil liberty, security issue and balance. There, I think, is a constantly shifting pendulum that is not static, but that we always have to bear in mind. But the two strategic issues within Europe that are, I think, really puts terrorism on the strategic level is, on the one hand, threat convergence and understanding when will terrorism use weapons of mass destruction, or perhaps, as we discussed in our workshop conference, when will they use nuclear terrorism, and what are the tremendous consequences to all of these things, of liberties, of response, of the value of deterrence. Let me just say, in the interest of time, just a couple of things. Threat convergence, CBRN, terrorism is an important issue. Within Europe, we are really struggling with another issue, which I know Fernando Renares will probably say a few words about, and that is, how do we prevent violent radicalization? How do we prevent the next generation from buying into this exclusionary ideology? And I can say from the experience we had within Europe, we are only really beginning to understand this issue of the global conflating into the local instantaneously. Just a year ago, I was watching in Sweden, in Stockholm, the Mohammed cartoon crisis in Denmark unfolding. And many Swedes were looking over the border saying, this has nothing to do with us. Well, lo and behold, we have had our own test of how far freedom of expression, of how far one can test those limits. And in a very short period of time, threats can convert from theoretical, hypothetical, into being a real target. I think it's tremendously difficult to counter this in terms of where do we place the center of gravity of explaining to the outside world what we are about, why we do things. And I think an enduring lesson is that they are doing it much quicker, much better than we are. They're winning in many ways some of the psychological warfare efforts. They're using the internet, they're using the dark underside of globalization extremely effectively. They're also using it in propaganda terms, and I think this is something that is very difficult to address. Let me just sort of explain to you the best way in which, for you to understand what really the complexity, what we are dealing with in the battle for their hearts and minds. At the heart of Al-Qaeda ideology, if you take away all the religious dictates, and it is truly an extremely dangerous ideology, extremely dangerous narrative, or should we say extremely difficult. They represent no negotiable agenda, but rather a very exclusionary ideology. A powerful narrative is at the heart of the Al-Qaeda ideology, and here the narrative extends beyond the perception of real and imaginary injustices against Muslims. And the force of this revolves around three distinctive but mutually reinforcing elements which may explain the widespread appeal. I think it's worthwhile remembering this, but whatever we do, this is the difficulty we have in confronting this. It is a narrative of humiliation, and one that is painted in primary colors. The core of this is that the West is at war with Islam, and daily evidence is barraging us of its aggressive design from conflict zones in which Muslims are seen as victims. Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Kashmir all blend into one. Reinforcing these are the metaphorical wars, the headscarf war in France, the cartoon war now in Denmark and Sweden, the row over the Pope's remarks, and countless other controversies. Now, all these conflicts and controversies, big and small, act like streams feeding into a single river. How do we deconstruct, how do we decompose, how do we meet that with public diplomacy is incredibly complex. The second element, the second theme, is redemptive violence offering to transform humiliation to inevitable victory, suffering to self-sacrifice, shame into honor. And the third theme is the projection of emotionally powerful imagery. These videos that are proliferating from different conflict zones, and taking together these three thematic elements make an extremely potent cocktail, and is often skillfully woven together as a formula for mobilization of resistance and recruitment. These are the heart beyond what Al-Qaeda is trying to achieve. How then do we meet that? Do we meet that on the, in terms of developing strategies on the local, regional, or on a global level? And I guess the real challenge, and I think I would recommend for those of you interested in this, there are a lot of interesting work being done in the United Kingdom, in Holland, in Denmark, in some of the other countries, but we're only beginning to address how do we prevent the next generation from buying in this exclusionary ideology? What platforms and vehicles do we use at the local, regional, or global level? And more importantly, how do we instill trust in the interaction between authorities and communities? Ultimately, most of the instruments we have at our disposal will have to be a mixture from the top down, but more importantly, most of the effective measures will be community-based initiatives that are addressing the issue of, in the aftermath of a terrorism incident, like the murder of Theo van Gogh that unleashed vast social tensions in Holland, like the other different terrorism events in London, Madrid. It is not just about responding effectively and provide security, but it's also about minimizing polarization within society, minimizing the strategic effects. And it is within that scheme that the last remarks that Brian Jenkins made about preserving civil liberties and putting this threat into perspective is so vitally important. And of course we need partnerships, we need dialogue on these issues. And it's been a privilege for me to be here. And I'll turn it over to the last European Hungarian speaker, and thank you for
Thank you, Magnus. Thank you, John. Thank you, Steve. It's quite an honor to be here today. I'd like to express my appreciation to UCF, especially for having been given the task to speak for 6 minutes on a topic which I usually teach for 13 weeks at postgraduate level. But what I'm going to do is, I've been here before, and I really enjoy my stints here. And one of the most enjoyable parts of the visits are not the very high-powered intellectual discussions by the experts, but it's the forums, because it's the Q&A that really challenges people like us to come up with responses to what really matter to the people who are concerned with these issues. Unfortunately today we can't stay for the Q&A, so I'm in a great position where I can throw out some hand grenades into the audience and my colleagues will have to deal with them later. So let me start by saying, firstly, it is ripe that we look at where we are today 6 years after 9/11. It's time for a review. You have a very important factor in the US right now, which is your presidential elections next year. So let's look at how far we have come in the last 6 years, how well we are doing, and how well they are doing. The first question is, what are we actually involved in? I don't want to get into a discussion here of international law and concepts of semantics. Some people say you shouldn't call this a war on terrorism, but for various reasons, it is a conflict of great, great significance. Terrorism is about the inculcation and the spreading of fear. As Brian has said, it is not our purpose to make more people afraid today, because then we will be assisting the terrorists. But one thing we have to note to all those people, I am not a neoconservative, but to all those people who poo-poo, who criticize the threat level and who say this is not a serious threat, let's deal with global warming, let's look at something else. I always say just one thing. As an old Cold Warrior, a person who really missed the simplicity of the Cold War, let's remember one thing. When Khrushchev banged his shoe on the table at the UN Assembly and said, "We will bury you," he never succeeded. He may have had 5,000 nuclear warheads. He may have wanted to bury us, but he never succeeded. In fact, Osama bin Laden achieved in accomplishing that which the Soviet Union, a superpower, could never accomplish: the mass murder of US citizens, 3,000 of them in 102 minutes, on the soil of the United States. So if anybody else tells you in the future this isn't a serious threat, remind them of that comparison. When it comes to comparing bin Laden, there is a second very serious difference. We talk about enemies in terms of their intent and their capability to hurt us. Whilst the Soviet Union may have wanted to hurt us and had the capability to do so, it was rational and therefore wanted to survive and therefore did not initiate thermonuclear war with us. Bin Laden has made it very, very clear. He has given out so-called fatwas which say it is the duty of all good Muslims, as he sees them, to acquire weapons of mass destruction and to use them against Christians and Jews. It's quite clear that if he obtains weapons of mass destruction capability, he will use them. There is no deterrent capability that we have. There is no balance of survivability rationales in this equation, and that's why he's a very dangerous foe. Nevertheless, it's not all about fear. Terrorism has existed for millennia. It is like theft, lying, prostitution, cheating. It's a thing that human societies always suffer from. As a result, you cannot eradicate it, so what do? You manage it. Counter-terrorism is an exercise in managing risks and minimizing risks. In that effort, we have to maintain our wide-reaching use of imagination. The thing that will protect us the most against terrorists is out-imagining them. What is the next completely innocent mode of transport, completely innocent modern technology that they will use against us? How can we protect ourselves from that exploitation before it occurs? Lastly, I'd like to say, echoing on the thoughts of my colleagues, this is a significant threat. However, it is manageable, and we will win this conflict. But one thing that I'd like everyone to take away with them, if it's just one thing, is it's going to take a long time. Unlike any other war, there will be no peace treaty. There will be no D-Day at the end of this, or a V-Day or VJ Day. There will be a long period where we grind down these people until they not only lose capability, but also motivation. Therefore, we need to have commitment. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm again Mark Thompson from the Office Coordinator for Counterterrorism. I think, with the exception of Madam Ambassador, I have the distinction of being the only government person here. So you'll hear that viewpoint, but I think it's fairly inclusive with the rest of the speakers today. First of all, the Department of State is not just about diplomacy. It's about the execution of our foreign policy. And our ambassadors, which Madam Ambassador has been one of those overseas, is responsible to the President, directly to the President, for the execution of that foreign policy. That includes a variety of tools of statecraft. Those include diplomacy, economics, law enforcement, intelligence, a wide variety. And those are supposed to compel our friends overseas as we work with them, tailored to that region, to cooperate with us. In my office, that's obviously focused on counterterrorism. But having spent 20 years as a Marine, jumping out of airplanes, jumping back into airplanes, jumping out of boats, getting back into boats, I know that my function for 20 years was that near battle. In military parlance, that was the guys 5 yards away that were threatening me. They needed to be taken care of. When we address counterterrorism, we're also looking at the 100-meter target, the 1,000-meter target, if I can keep using that metaphor. So that's where we come in and where we're trying to achieve that success for the United States government. I couldn't agree more that that success will be incremental. It won't be one that we immediately recognize. We didn't immediately recognize when the Soviet Union was falling apart, and neither will we when Al-Qaeda falls apart or other folks working against our interests. As part of that, we go after the safe havens that harbor terrorists. It's those safe havens aren't just places like Somalia, ungoverned spaces, but it also includes virtual space like the internet. It also includes ideological space where thoughts and intent to go after and to conduct terrorist activities nurture themselves. That can be even in the United States, as we well know from our own experience in Oklahoma City. On another front, public diplomacy. I'm sure many of you have heard of that. Some call it strategic communications. We have to get a lot better at that, and we're working at that. What does that mean? To me, that means getting the truth out and getting it out very quickly. Our adversaries can do a horrible act overseas and have that act on the internet, on YouTube, within a matter of less than a few hours. We do good things around the world every day. Every organization in our government, the military, USAID, a lot of folks all over the world, we need to get that out. It's the truth. We need to tell the truth. We need to tell it quickly and effectively. Education. Here, you have a great example of that. You have, I'm sure, a very diverse audience here. Hopefully, a lot of folks that aren't native-born Americans. That's what brings our values to other people. When they see the free flow of ideas that come at places like this, at venues like this, it makes a big difference. And I've seen that overseas. I was in a Central Asia conference some years ago where we were discussing the cooperation that would be necessary if a biological attack affected one of the Central Asia states. In that discussion were a variety of people my age and older who were the old Soviet Guard folks who, when asked, what would you do if this happened, immediately came back and said, we'll ask the president, he'll tell us what to do. I said, well, we're looking for something a little more creative than that, and trying to instill in them, or at least let them come up with the idea that the boss needs to get some options. He needs to know what's going on the ground so he can make an informed decision, not just a blind decision. And one of the people that really got that was a young lady that I remember from Armenia who had been educated in an Ivy League school. She was young, she was female, and in that environment that was still a hard road to hoe for her. But she got her points out, and she wouldn't have gotten those points out probably unless she'd been in the U.S., unless she'd been exposed to environments like this. So our freedoms and what we take advantage of or take for granted each day are extremely valuable as we fight this war as well. It also creates a trusted network, and that trusted network is what we achieve every time we do something overseas cooperatively with our host nation partners. It's not about the U.S. doing something overseas. It's about helping partner nations do something to defend their own sovereignty. It's not just about us protecting from another 9/11. As I pointed out earlier today, 90 other nations had citizens that were killed in 9/11. 90 other nations. It wasn't just us that day. And it's not just us today either. This all takes a very diverse team to achieve. I equated it this morning, and I'm sure on the University of Central Florida you have the rugby club, the debate club, and the chess club. And imagine getting those team of teams and then having to win the Super Bowl when defeat was unacceptable. That's what we do in the interagency in Washington, some more effectively than others. And you can come up with your own perception of which team represents which agency, but the point is it's still a team, and that team has to have a good coach and good leadership. And as the gentlemen and ladies formulate their recommendations for the next administration, hopefully high on that list will be political courage, because making the decisions necessary to do what we're going to do in the future will take a great amount of political courage to achieve. And it won't be to the liking of every one of our agencies of government, and it won't be to the liking of everyone in our population as well. Lastly, and I would be remiss, and I was never a recruiter in the Marine Corps, but I'll be a recruiter today. There's a variety of folks here, from folks that are even older than me to people that are a lot younger than me here today. And I'm sure some of the older folks in the audience have served their country in a variety of ways, whether it was teaching, whether it was the military, whether it was USAID overseas, or wherever it may be. They were on the playing field, and I would encourage you to get on the playing field. It is something that I've found as frustrating as ever been in my life, and as fulfilling as I've ever felt in my life. When we've gotten good things done, we've saved lives, we've done the right thing. And at the end of the day, it's about doing the right thing. I'll close with an example. I was in Basilan Island in southern Philippines, and this goes back to the greatest generation, which is represented here today. And this lady that was in her 80s told me that she remembered the Seabees coming through in World War II. And they built that hospital, they built that school, and they helped us get on our feet after the Japanese left. And she still remembered when I came in as the only American in the group, she hugged me, gave me a big grin, and the whole thing. Not because I did anything, but because those who came before me did. So I encourage you to find that willingness and that idea to go and serve your country in whatever way you want to. I spoke to a young lady already today who's going to take the Foreign Service exam, and that's one way of doing it, and there's lots of other ways. So please make that a strong consideration. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, allow me first of all to thank again Professor Sloan for inviting me to be at UCF for this occasion. I come from Spain, so I come from a country which has a tremendous experience in suffering and fighting terrorism, mainly because of ETA. You are now more familiar with ETA because of this global terrorism fight. But although it only became listed by the United States Department of State as a terrorist organization in the late 90s, that is 900 people being killed after. Now we are all concerned with the phenomenon of global terrorism. And let me start by saying something perhaps of your interest, now that everyone points out to foreign policy as a root cause, and I don't like that expression, of international terrorism. When the Madrid bombings took place, and I was precisely here in Florida that very day, when the Madrid bombings took place, many people in my country established a linear cause between the Spanish government siding with the US government in the invasion of Iraq and what happened in Madrid on March 11, 2004. You can partly understand this because 90% of the Spanish public were against the invasion of Iraq. The Spanish public opinion never understood that Iraq was part of any counterterrorism program. However, the Spanish public opinion was always, and is still today, in favor of intervening in Afghanistan, because we do really believe Afghanistan was part of a counterterrorism program after September 11. However, and you know that my government, after the Madrid bombings, decided to withdraw the troops. It was not giving in to the terrorists. I completely disagree with the timing of the decision, 5 weeks after the bombings, because it looks like there is a direct relationship between the bombings and the withdrawal of the troops. But the withdrawal of the troops was an electoral promise made by political elites who, as I insist that, on that idea again, did not agree on the fact that invading Iraq was part of any anti-terrorist program, and thought that the invasion of that country will make things worse. I do believe that they were right in the assessment, although I strongly disagree with one government in withdrawing the troops so quickly after the Madrid bombings, and with little warning to our allies, of course, chiefly among them the United States. Now, my fellow countrymen started to question this idea about foreign policy when, they thought, well, if we withdraw from Iraq, then the threat is over for Spain. Now, 3 years and a half, more than that, after the Madrid bombings, the threat from Al-Qaeda in Spain is greater. And you know what foreign policy are they blaming on us now? Our 15th century policy of establishing a kingdom in Spain, and therefore the end of Al-Andalus, which was part of the much of what is currently Spain between 18th century until 15th century was Al-Andalus, that was a Muslim land. So our problem now is with that foreign policy. So people started to really question these connections between foreign policy. There must be something really strange with these people when they have to make all these claims out of time and senseless. Now, having said so, this global terrorism, we know about Al-Qaeda, and you consider Al-Qaeda to be a major threat here, if not the major threat. But global terrorism is now an increasingly complex phenomenon, an evolving phenomenon made out of a number of actors. Al-Qaeda itself, then the territorial extensions or territorial branches of Al-Qaeda, namely Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in the land of the two rivers, and so on. Then we have groups which are associated to Al-Qaeda, and over the past 4 years, over 30 of those groups have perpetrated terrorist attacks throughout the world. And we have other actors within this network. Now, every month this year, we had over 600 terrorist attacks by or related to Al-Qaeda. Over 6, and you might be asking, how come? Where? Well, nearly 500 terrorist attacks related with Al-Qaeda last January only in Iraq. Nearly 100 Taliban attacks, that Al-Qaeda related attacks, in Afghanistan. And then you might add other scenarios such as Algeria, the Philippines, Pakistan, India, and so on. So when global terrorism attacks us in our own land, that happens from time to time. So there must be something wrong in the common characterization of global terrorism nowadays in our societies, in our mass media. For instance, we think global terrorism is a completely new phenomenon because of this extraordinary lethality it shows. Catastrophic terrorism. Yeah, we have the image of 9/11, but most of the attacks caused no more than 2 victims, than 2 mortal victims, and are perpetrated by ordinary explosives or small firearms. So it's quite more conventional than we tend to think, although it is true that non-conventional weapons and even weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, is a real threat, although perhaps sometimes overestimated. Now, we also say this is a completely new phenomenon because of its suicide factor, suicide bombers. Well, no more. Overall, no more than 15% of all the terrorist attacks related to Al-Qaeda are suicide bombings. Even the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam have a higher suicide rate than jihadist terrorism nowadays. Not to mention that the lethality rates per attack was higher, for instance, among neo-fascist terrorists in Italy during the 80s. If you go to Bologna, you can go to the train station, and there you have the 84 victims of a single terrorist attack by neo-fascist terrorists in Italy in 1981. So it seems like nothing of this ever happened, isn't it? And then the last thing, our media in the US, in Europe, constantly portraying global terrorism as a phenomenon which is directed chiefly against the West and predominantly against the US. That is what Osama bin Laden says, and Ayman al-Zawahiri says, and all the leaders and ideologues, second-rank ideologues of the rest of the groups and organizations involved in this network. Now, is this true? No longer. No longer. It might be the rhetoric, but the reality is no longer that rhetoric at all, not that reality at all. As from the year 2004, over 75% of all those individuals killed by Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda related groups and entities are Muslims. Local population in the Muslim world. And this is a key factor that we have to keep in mind when, for instance, when countering ideologically global terrorism. When countering, struggling against terrorism is always a legitimacy struggle. So it is a very weak element for them to the fact that they are killing predominantly among Muslims. A very last point. If they are killing Muslims, a very last point, because I know that you have this debate about the withdrawal of troops in Iraq and so on, and the future of global terrorism. And I do have something to say from a European perspective, which is not the usual European perspective, in the sense that many of the Europeans I know, and I see them every day, are in favor of a quick withdrawal of the troops from Iraq. Now, if Al-Qaeda in Iraq is killing mostly Muslims, and not only Shia, but they have this tremendous campaign, terrorist campaign, in there where the Sunni population is living, in the center and west of the country. Then, unless we have a solid internal arrangement between ethno-religious groups before the withdrawal or before the reduction of troops, unless we have a sufficient arrangement between the regional powers before troops are removed substantially, unless we have a worldwide arrangement, probably through the United Nations, before the troops are removed, the impact on the future of global terrorism on our own security will be tremendous for the benefit of the terrorists and not for our own benefit. Thank you very much.
I must say I have a tough act to follow with distinguished speakers, and they had a great time, and their insights, as I said, will be published, and we do very much hope that it will help to some degree to increasingly frame the continuing debate as we go into the election cycle. And I would urge you all to consider, irrespective of, and I appreciate this, your particular political position, to really listen carefully as to whether the respective candidates are engaging in rhetoric or actually providing concrete assessments of the threat and offering concrete policy alternatives. What I think we all face is, and understandably with election year, a lot of posturing and a lot of generalities. And I think it's very, very important that we as citizens raise the ante intellectually and understandably request that we get something more than the shibboleths of generalized statements in regards to terrorism. I'm very struck and very pleased to be here working with the Office of Global Perspectives with John Garcia and our staff, because we are very, very committed to international programs and bringing people like my esteemed colleagues here. We have a couple, God bless them, sitting a little fatigued in the audience, and I hope you're feeling a little better. I didn't know you just came up.
It's a sneak attack.
Well, Josh is one of our distinguished graduate students who is now going on for his PhD, and I'm going to let him give some of his background as you go on, okay? So, I'm sorry, Josh, I didn't know you, the stealth student, you know, it's good when you deal with terrorism, that's your stealth-like. But let me get on to something more specific on this issue, because there was a major theme that has been addressed. And let me just briefly tell you what terrorism is and what's significant to you. First of all, terrorism is not mindless violence. And that's very important to understand. To just simply say the individuals who engage in terrorism are crazy ignores the fact that primarily terrorism is a purposeful act to achieve certain goals. And it's important that you understand it is not mindless violence, because if it's mindless violence, you don't understand what it is or how to respond to it. Clearly, there are those terrorist individuals who are crazies. But that's an individual thing. But taken as a totality, and in regards to most terrorists, in terms of the studies that have been done over the year, in many ways, ironically, but is it really that way? In many ways, they're perfectly normal. And then you can debate normalcy, but I want to indicate that to you. The second thing is, and it's important, and I think our colleague from Spain has addressed this very, very nicely. There's all kinds of motivation for terrorism, but traditionally when we deal with terrorism, we talk about it to achieve political goals. And this is highly, highly significant, because terrorists indeed have effectively, especially now, placed themselves on the global agenda. And as our colleagues indicated earlier, for small groups to engage in getting such incredible publicity and influencing, in this case, U.S. foreign policy, and helping to be a part of generating a profound and often nasty debate, serves to underscore, in the military they talk about force multipliers. Terrorists can, by their actions, and there are small groups basically, political multipliers. They maximize their size through the media and through the response to carry their message of what has traditionally been called armed propaganda or propaganda by the gun to a broader audience. The next one I think is important, that terrorism ultimately deals not only with the threat, but the act of violence. And I want to indicate that the term violence is often used too generally in regards to terrorism. There are those who say, well, terrorism doesn't necessarily have to engage in violence. But I would suggest to you that ultimately, if terrorism is going to be credible, the threat is not enough. There must be indeed physical violence. And we can talk about that, if you will, in terms of the implication of the internet, etc. That's another set of issues. The next one I think is highly significant. Brian Jenkins, who was here, spoke about this earlier. But what he said much earlier in his pioneering work, terrorism is aimed at the people watching. It's aimed at you and me. Alas and alack, when individuals are dead, they're dead. And I'm not talking about the transcendental nature of where they may go or whatnot, but terrorism is aimed at the survivors. And the key point here, and I want to emphasize this to you, and we've addressed this at some length, that terrorism is ultimately a form of psychological warfare. It's an attempt to instill fear and intimidation to a broader audience. And it impacts on all of us. I'll give only one illustration, but it's one that I have constantly seen at this university and other places. Anytime there's a bombing attack overseas, the issue comes up, especially if it's May, is it safe to go over to Europe? And, you know, and for parents here with youngsters who are going to go on programs, the same question comes up, is it safe? Well, the point I'm driving at, and our colleague just addressed this, the chances of being subject to a threat of terrorism, an act of terrorism, is much less than being mugged, as I was in Oklahoma City many years ago. Well, I'm glad there's a laugh. I didn't find it that funny, but some of my students might have. But the point I'm really driving at is that if you change your plans and so forth, in a sense, you're buying in to terrorism. Because by changing your plans, etc., you are being intimidated, and that is not the appropriate thing to do. In too many cases, what happens is after an incident occurs, and you see the images, and you see them over and over and over and over, and I'm saying that very directly, whether you got a 6-year-old child or grandchild, or whether you're talking about yourself, right? Look at the images, for example, the World Trade Center, over and over and over. Well, when you witness that type of thing, basically what happens, and understandably people react. And understandably, in many cases, what? Overreact, and that's a human condition. But that is the overreaction, whether it's in terms of changing your values or attitudes, or in terms of changing your lifestyle and so forth, right? Or making demands in terms of more rigorous security measures at the cost of civil liberties, is a very dangerous thing, because that's precisely what terrorists want. They want us to overreact. And that is why it's very important to have a knowledge as to what terrorism is. Because if you know what terrorism is, you won't overreact. One of the things I have the pleasure of with my students here at the university, and in my own work and with my colleagues, is to focus heavily on the issue of education. And I'm delighted to see we have people here from the high schools, because we're working very closely with you. You're the ones who are going to be very, very vital on this. Because if you understand the nature of terrorism, you will be engaged in helping for you not to overreact, but other people not to overreact. And certainly I appreciate that you are concerned, for example, about people being terrorized, but not terrorism. There's a difference. Terrorism is what? Purposeful acts for political purposes. And I am talking from your own perspective in regards to violence in the schools. That's a broader set of issues than what I'm referring to. But the education function is absolutely vital. And I would urge all of you, particularly those of you who are in the school system and so forth, and I'm doing a little proselytizing now, it is absolutely essential that you as young men and women, as you move on into college and as you move on beyond that, are educated in terms of the nature of terrorism. It is protracted in nature. It is not going away. And you will understand and be able to deal with it much more if you know, if you will, the nature of the beast, instead of catastrophizing, which tends to be the case. Finally, and again, I want to emphasize a point with you. Terrorists win, and I think that this point, this theme has come up, and they do win when we are terrorized. And to an older generation here, who well know what I'm referring to, President Roosevelt during the Depression, in his inauguration, really nailed it when he said, the only thing you have to fear is fear itself, mindless fear itself, unreasoned fear itself. If you know the nature of terrorism, you will be able, by that in itself, to start to neutralize what terrorists like to do, and that's engage in terrorizing. So I would urge all of you to get involved in understanding the nature of terrorism, and one of the ways of doing that is on the state and local level, being aware of the threat, not overstating it or understating it, right? Being involved as a community. But beyond that, particularly internationally, you are required as citizens to understand the nature of international politics and where terrorism fits. It is not a happening. And I want to end on this note. I think, as Brian Jenkins says, we have gone through a lot of challenges. And this is another one. And there's not going to be any glorious victory parades. The ultimate test of beating terrorists, if you want to say that, is the will of a people to sustain and meet the challenge, not give in to either fear or give in to overreaction. And this country has had to deal with that and will have to deal with it in the future. So I urge you, please, get more involved in regards to international affairs, get more involved in terms of understanding the nature of terrorism. And I want to mirror one thing our colleague who left from the State Department. You notice he wasn't recruiting for the Marines directly. I think that's what he wanted. I am not going to be a recruiter myself because although I'm proud that I protected the Brooklyn Navy Yard against Russian attack and was very, very successful. But I want to end on this note. I'm not talking about military, civilian, the whole 9 yards. I think this is very crucial, and this is primarily for the students here. The concept of public service in regards not only to combating terrorism, but the responsibilities in regard to citizenship are very significant. And whether you want to join the Peace Corps or the military or the State Department or NGOs involved in attempting to alleviate violence, please do it. We need people like you, and it's the young who should do it, because you're the ones who are going to be living the life after us. And in many cases, as the Chinese say, it's a curse and a blessing, and this is particularly for the younger people. The curse and blessing. May you live in interesting times. You live in interesting times. Thank you very much.